Right, so I don't remember if Gita mentioned that we did a count of had a quick look through the participants, and there's about between 20 and 25 people who we don't believe have been to a Dyalog conference before, which was a very nice number to see. So I'd better introduce myself. I'm Morten Kromberg, CTO of Dyalog. This is the 8th logo that I've had the pleasure of doing this talk over. And I'm very pleased about that. As some of you know, I think I've mentioned this before, when I realized I wasn't going to make fighter pilot in the Norwegian Air Force. What I wanted to be really from the age of about 16 was somebody who worked in an APL interpreter design and development team. So I still have to pinch myself occasionally. I come into the office and it's like a little boy waking up in a toy shop, working in an APL development team. Of course, there is a bit of a challenge in pretending to manage these people who are all smarter than you are. But fortunately, at Dyalog, because of the motivation, it really is mostly a question of convincing the people that you have correctly understood what the customer requirement is and explaining it to them. And that's why these conferences are so important to us, because they provide a real opportunity for you to meet the team. It's why we always bring nearly all of the technical staff to these meetings, even in the United States, so they can meet you firsthand and really understand. And then my job is actually over if you can tell them directly. I just stand by and watch as they get to work. Right, so there's a bit of sort of ritual repetition about this. If you were in Boston last year, you'll remember this picture, the roadmap. The goals are still the same, this utopian place where everybody who might benefit from APL has been told about it at school, and everybody who tries to use the product agrees that it's just an undiluted, delightful experience in every way. It executes at ludicrous speed. But the roadmap hasn't changed. You can see there's still a long way to go, and there are a few bumps. But we're heading in the right direction still, I feel. Now, before talking about where we're going, maybe a quick recap of what we did last year, because there's more and more stuff going on each year. It's not just a question of putting out a new version of APL, which is something we generally do each year. But there are a whole bunch of other things that went out. Gita mentioned the unregistered version, or as we call it, the annoying version of APL, because you don't have to register, but it pops up every 20 minutes or so, roughly, to tell you that it's an unregistered version. And if you want it to stop doing that, you need to go and register. And then you may remember Jeff did a presentation in Princeton a couple of years, 3 years ago? On project he was starting looking at then, and he should really be congratulated for eventually getting Xorg, who handle this kind of thing in the Linux community, to accept our keyboards as part of the standard. So in recent versions of Linux, they come with the APL keyboard pre-installed. And it's a fairly simple process once they get the bugs ironed out of their features, their bugs in Linux, of just picking the APL keyboard and setting it up for use there. We're trying to talk to the guys in Redmond about this, but at the moment they're trying to throw stuff out of Windows to make it smaller for Windows 8. So it's not the right time, but we'll keep trying. Try APL, I guess maybe slightly more than half of you saw Brian's presentation yesterday. I'm going to risk trying to click on this. Actually, I know I have the window open already. So Try APL is an interactive site where people can just go to it without installing keyboards or fonts or anything. They can just go in, and there's lots of expressions they can click on. Define a function, just click on that, it happens, and then call it. And John Scholes has been working on tutorials, the Sudoku solver, and so on. If you weren't here yesterday evening, we recorded the session, and it should be up later. sometime later. I don't know how many people are using Pocket APL. Ray Cannon's here somewhere. This was the end of the old Pocket APL product line simply for the reason that Microsoft no longer makes that version of the operating system. So Windows Mobile 6 was the last operating system in that line. The Pocket APL releases were lagging a bit behind. We weren't doing every one, but we finally thought we'd wrap that up with the 12.1 and put that to bed nicely. MyServer 2.0, that's our web development framework. Still a little bit simple, but it's getting to the point, and Brian will be showing you some of what you can do with that later today. It's getting to the point where you can really build web applications using pure APL and no additional frameworks. That's becoming very significant for us. Gita mentioned the Dyalog file server, and that, as she mentioned, went into production, and I see some of the people involved in the project are here, which means it must be working. So that's good news. And hopefully the week will go well and they'll actually do the talk about that on Wednesday. They'll still be here. And version 13.2, where's Richard? Is this a correct statement? Yes, thank you. Right, and the most important thing that went out in that year, I guess, is still... Well, I think actually TryAPL in many ways was the most exciting and interesting thing we did in terms of reaching those hills. But version 13.1 was by far the largest bit of work that we did. And how many people are using it daily? Okay, not that many yet. I was going to claim that one of the things we've achieved recently is that people tend to upgrade and start using the versions very quickly. But maybe there wasn't enough in 13.1 to get people really excited about it. As the number suggests, it's an incremental update. There's nothing really big in here. Performance enhancements. Actually, the thing that we spent a lot of time on and may actually have slowed a few things down was this second item here. We started on this process 2-3 releases ago. It took us 3 releases to get to the point where we feel comfortable saying that there are really now no known limitations in the interpreter if you're using the 64-bit version on array size, other than how much memory you have available. Unfortunately, there are a few cases where the interpreter slowed down as a result because we had to move to using different indexing structures for a few things. But we're hoping to gain all of that back in other areas. A related project to that, curiously, is that we needed a new random number generator, because if you wanted to index a random element out of an array, the arrays can now be so big that the old random number generator didn't have the range to index all of the elements. You only had 2 to the 31st different results coming out of the old random number generator. So we'd been thinking about this Mersenne twister, which I think is sort of the state of the art in statistics at the moment, and this was the time to put that in, so that's why it went in. The extended diagnostic message, that's something that where QuadDM, the error reporting in APL is a fairly terse thing. It says domain error when something goes wrong. And that's something we wanted to enhance for quite a while. So in version 13.1, particularly when you get an error where the operating system issued some kind of error, like you try to tie a file and the file doesn't exist, you won't just get file name error, you'll get the actual details of what happened, which operating system call failed, so you can look it up and find out what's wrong with the network or the permissions or whatever, rather than just getting the file name error. File history function, that's actually part of the DFS project in many ways, because, and that's also true for the enlist with selective assignment, these are features that exist in other APL systems, mainframe systems typically, and to accommodate the refugees finally coming off mainframes, we've started to add this kind of feature. And the rest are probably not worth talking a lot about. They're nice if you... Well, component file journaling, we've now reached the point where the oldest supported version of Dyalog APL supports file journaling, and therefore we've made the default file journaling level 1, because that without any significant performance impact, gives a significant increase in the reliability of component files if you have a flaky network, for example. And that's sort of our general policy. We've done this a few times, that we'll introduce a new feature and you'll have to turn it on until we reach the point where the oldest supported version of the product will understand that feature, and then we make it the default. Okay, so here's a slide where we always have an argument in the development group about whether this slide should be in my presentation or not. That might be a disconcerting number. I think the reality is that most users see few errors because they get into a pattern of using the product, of course, where they don't hit them anymore. But we do have still a sizable database of issues ranging from trivial things. So this number here covers all kinds of issues, documentation errors, bad things and then fairly nasty things. But we are really working on every release expect a number like this every year, I hope, for another couple of years, and then they'll all be gone. Unless you keep reporting more, of course. But this is an area where we really focus on, and the version 13.1 cycle was a lot of the time that was spent in putting that release together was actually going after the old bug list. So the next release, which we are planning to, should appear in beta testing in November, December, and come out in January, at the end of January. Again, it's an interim release. There's not a lot of meaty enhancements here, except the GUI enhancements, which John Daintree will spend most of his talk talking about, I think, where we were really expecting that the Quad WC GUI was something that we could put to bed about 5 years ago, that everybody would be going to HTML, well, not HTML5 then, but WPF, Silverlight, and HTML5, and we wouldn't need to do any more work on Quad WC. But this year we consulted with some of our major customers who we know do a lot of GUI work, and the conclusion was that the new technologies that are coming onto the market are not really at a stage yet where people feel comfortable committing to the next 5-year or 10-year development cycle going with WPF or HTML5, etc. So we've done quite a lot of work to allow you to build really sort of Windows 7 style applications using the traditional Quad WC GUI. We've finally done a project that several of you have been asking for, which is to allow DLLs that you write to access the contents of the workspace directly rather than having the data copied as it goes from the one side to the other. That's not something that we're making generally available. You need to come and talk to us about it, and maybe we'll ask you to come to Bramley for a couple of days for a course, because you need to learn a bit about the internals, how to call our memory manager, etc. And then speed up, something we spend more and more time on. Roger's been spearheading some of this. Richard Smith went back to the search and replace the regular expression code that was put in a couple of years ago, and now is the time to pick a few things to enhance the performance of. We're aiming to have full support for APL2 selective assignment. There were a number of cases. We did the enlist case in 13.1, but the goal for 13.2 is that any selective specification expression you can write in APL2, you'll be able to write in Dyalog APL. One area where we do have not just a few bugs, there's a group of users out there, and you know who you are, who combine object-oriented programming with multi-threading and the use of defuns at the same time. And those people have a higher incident of issues with the product than a lot of other people, because although we tested all those things individually, we didn't quite imagine that people who want to write classes using defuns, because mentally we see those as really, either you're an ISI person or you're a DOI person, but you put features into the product and people will combine them in ways that you really hadn't imagined. So this is an area where I think both in 13.2 and then we'll need to continue working in 14.0 to iron out both some remaining bugs but also usability issues. Now that the community has 6 or 7 years of experience of using object-oriented programming and scripted classes and namespaces, it's time to go back to that and consult with users. We had a very good BAA moot in May, where John Daintree and Andy were, and got a lot of very good feedback from British APL users. If you have any comments or thoughts about how the class editor and namespace editor work, please send them to us. We'll be looking closely at that for the next year or so. David's editor, and here's take note of this. This is only going to be available for Windows Unicode, and we do not currently have any intention of asking David to do the extra work to get it to support translation to classic APL characters. And the likelihood of us introducing features that are only available for Unicode, maybe eventually only available on 64-bit, etc., is slowly increasing. How many people here use Visual Studio? Quite a few, yeah? But maybe not so many using it in conjunction with APL or APL projects. This is a feature that's been available, I think, since the very first Dyalog.net implementation more than 10 years ago. But we're now starting to do more work on enhancing the ability to build projects in Visual Studio and build Excel add-ins or SharePoint web parts and so on. Typical components where you would want to be at least working together with people using Visual Studio and use the Visual Studio, the same tools that they use for project management, etc. And then there's a little item here that the online backups that Gita spoke of are not in the current version of DFS that people are using, but they will be there once we have a version based on 13.2. We need to do some work in the file system itself to enable that. Okay, so here's another contentious slide. I thought we'd have it, and I think we have it at the end of the talks last year. I'd have it a bit earlier this year and get the unpleasantness out of the way. Now, deprecated doesn't mean that there's any imminent risk that any of these features will disappear, because we're still a small company, and if we have any significant user base using features, we don't take them out. But you should know that these things slow us down. When we are trying to add new features to APL, we have to think, how does that interact with external variables? Or could there be some bugs in the crossover between DDE events coming in and this new thing? We've upgraded the component file system several times over the last few years, and we've always maintained backwards compatibility. So you'll be able to open a component file created in version, what should I promise? I don't think that's true if you take a 6.2 file that was made on an Intel box and you open it on a 64-bit AIX machine. Yeah. So some of the things that we've been putting into the component file system are exactly this interoperability feature, that you can create a file on Windows and use it on AIX. And combining that with old architectures of the component file system is something that sort of makes Richard's life harder and harder as he contemplates, like the online backup mechanism. That's only going to be supported for 64-bit large span files. Well, that's what you're campaigning for anyway. So on. So if you're using any of these, and you don't see an easy way to get out of them. I mean, the Classic Edition is not an easy thing to get out of. But I've been very encouraged on the trips that I've done to visit customers this last year, in that I was actually surprised. A lot of people have made this move now. I think I met more people using Unicode than Classic this year. And it's only been 5 years. Right. Now looking ahead, what is beyond version 13.2? And it's not just what we were saying last year. There is one significant change. And you'll have noticed that Jonathan is not doing a presentation on APL Sharp this year. And we've been talking about the ride for quite a while, and you probably expected to see it released last year. I did anyway, at one point. But that hasn't happened either, because Microsoft has decided that Silverlight is no longer their key focus. I'm not sure exactly how they would word it if you asked them, because they've promised to support it for another 12 years or something. But it's not where they're putting all their energy. And it's not just a Microsoft thing. I mean, these guys on the client side are also out if you're thinking about phones and tablets, new devices. Nobody wants browser plugins. And that's essentially what Microsoft realized, was they couldn't win that battle. They tried for a while to convince people you should put the Silverlight plugin, and then you'll be able to run APL in the browser and all sorts of esoteric languages. They decided they couldn't win that battle. It's going to be JavaScript on the browser side. And that means that the APL Sharp project, which had the Silverlight runtime as sort of the prime use case, the obvious immediate win for putting out that project, is now really a research project. We're not stopping the project, because we did a lot of what I felt was very valuable language design for when we eventually, when there's a new, we know that we've talked to people at Oracle, for example, who say they're working on a new version, a completely new generation of virtual machines that will support array languages much better. They've built an experimental J interpreter in the Oracle labs, I learned at the J Software conference. Not because they want to go out and compete with J Software, but because they want to run array language benchmarks on their future possible virtual machines. So this project is not dead, but it's going to go slowly for a while until we learn a bit more about what the next generation of potential target platforms is. And the remote IDE that you've seen demonstrated a couple of times running on Silverlight is going to be replaced by a family of native RIDE implementations targeting various platforms. So the bad news, as I mentioned, is we will not be able to do the things that I demonstrated a couple of times with Silverlight running APL on the client side in the browser to manipulate what's happening in the browser. You're going to have to go to the My Server and tools like that to run APL applications on browsers, or use web services. But this battle, we'll do this battle, we'll rejoin the battle a bit later. But this is actually, after I had a night where I couldn't sleep when I heard that Microsoft was abandoning Silverlight. I don't know if you've seen the video where Hitler learns about the death of Silverlight on YouTube. Go and watch that. The first time I said, I have to agree with that man. Everything he said makes sense. There was a Dane who got into a lot of trouble saying that at the Cannes Film Festival, I remember. But Google that. There's also the video where Hitler learns about APL Sharp. If you haven't seen that one, Google that as well. There are rumors that members of the Dyalog development team were involved in the production of that, but I haven't been able to corroborate that. But the good news is, in fact, that these new platforms that everybody now has on their cell phones and smartphones are the development environments there that are recommended are native. People are expected to write C, Objective-C, C++, or perhaps in the case of Android, Java, but Java as a native programming language on the environment rather than something that runs in the browser. And that means that the good old Dyalog APL that we all already have lots of code written in is going to be able to run on these platforms, we think. So we're doing the research on that now. And that's where we'll be focusing our efforts for the next couple of years. And with the RIDE, you'll be able to sit on your Mac and do development on an iPad or whatever. That's the idea. And with the My Server, you can still target these devices with applications right now by writing My Server applications. So on the web page, there should, I don't know if it's there yet, but it will soon be uploaded, a folder containing 3 documents that detail this strategy, where we're focusing on these 6 areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about them now, but there's much more detail. There's about 15 pages in combined of text about these. And I think in your pack there's a page with the number 5 at the bottom, which is actually the last page of one of these, which is a voting form. And we're not promising to follow any of your votes, but we'd be very happy if you give us some feedback on how you think this fits with your own development plans. Okay, so briefly on each of these 6 items. Performance, of course, this is something that will never go away. We'll be working on this forever. We have some ideas. Jay isn't here, but he's working on a project to reduce parser overhead, because we've discovered that this is one of the things that Roger and Jay and I have really noticed working on tuning projects recently, is that APL interpreters have tended to, in fact, spend a lot of time optimizing very large arrays. But when you collect the Applemon and profile data from customers, they're all using small arrays. So the parser project is something to significantly speed up the, in particular, these small function calls that tend to dominate applications. The characteristics of modern CPUs, we've talked about this before, they're very cache. Algorithms really need to be sensitive to cache. There's a lot of work we can do, we think, to speed up the memory manager to take advantage or adapt to how these modern processors work. This is something that will be strategic for us always, I think, performance. Portability is the other big push. So we've talked about most of this already. We want to run on all these platforms, implement native rides. Windows Desktop, of course, is the first one, so that's maybe not for people who want to develop something on a smartphone necessarily, but they have a server application running in a room somewhere that they can't actually go. They'll be able to use the ride to connect to it remotely. After the server's crashed, after the fact, they can go and connect to it. We are going to look at making native implementations for all these different platforms. Fortunately, all of these are some form of variant on Linux, with the exception of Windows 8, which is a variant on Windows, of course. And like the .NET bridge that we currently make available on Windows so that you can access the major object-oriented platforms and frameworks there, we will build bridges that functionally work in very much the same way, as far as we can do it, on all of these platforms. So on Android, it's going to be a bridge to Java. On Windows 8, the thing they used to call Metro, I think they then discovered there's a large company in Europe called Metro, and they were sued, I think, over the name. So they're now, the thing called Metro is now, I'm crackling. Is that, I mean, oh no, not the mic. And on the Macintosh, the Mac, the Apple platforms, it's something called Cocoa, which is the object framework. Hopefully we're going to be able to do this in such a way that the syntax is so similar that if you can find a third-party vendor who makes a GUI framework that targets all of these platforms, your APL code will need no changes or almost no changes to move across these platforms, because there will be third-party vendors who make cross-platform libraries. For example, Qt and other tools already exist. There's much more detail about this in one of the documents in the folder. Parallel computing is one of the new things that we're really focusing on. Perhaps the biggest challenge for any language vendor, doesn't matter whether you're APL or any other language, is harnessing all the parallel hardware that's appearing. And again, there's a document describing some new features which we used to call asynchronous namespaces. You may remember a presentation on Parallel Each many years ago where this was the underlying framework for that. At the moment, parallel each is implemented as an APL user-defined operator with using TCP/IP for communications. We're planning to integrate that with the interpreter so that it becomes very much easier to use. We've been fortunate to find that there's significant interest in the academic world, rapidly growing interest in addressing this issue. And the next talk by Andrej Filinski from the University of Copenhagen is about this. So he's going to be talking about some of the work being done at the University of Copenhagen. We've found people in Indiana, in Scotland, who want to do research and who are interested in involving us in this research. So that's very, very encouraging. It's long-term work. This is not simple. Don't expect something to come out of this immediately. But it's something which, if we're able to crack it, could suddenly put APL right bang in the mainstream of computing as a tool that very many people will be interested in. If we can put parallel programming at the fingertips of domain experts, that will be very, very significant. And then there are some simple things we may be able to do in the interpreter at the moment. I think APL plus Win already optimizes this case. So when you have 3 large arrays involved in an expression like that, currently the APL interpreter will generate a large temporary result. But with the new parser work that Jay is doing, we may be able to easily recognize expressions like this and start using much less temporary memory and using the cache much more effectively. So here's, I thought one of these features, the asynchronous namespaces, I'll try and make a picture of and see if I can explain it. I've tried before without much success, so let me know afterwards how this goes. So here's a workspace. And here's an expression that says, make 3 empty isolates. So this is a little planet you can see of its own. So make me 3 planets, not copying anything into them. And you hit enter. And it creates, in fact, what are 3 new workspaces, having their own interpreter thread, but accessible in such a way that we can very easily write an expression like this. So this is a vector of 3 isolates, and we say .x, and here is a vector of 3 elements, and what happens is that gets I mean, this you can actually do this today with namespaces, but the difference here is that those namespaces actually have their own interpreter thread, and they will execute in completely in parallel when you run expressions in there. For example, if you were to say average x in each one of these namespaces and hit enter, then those 3 expressions will run in parallel. In this case, it'd probably just slow you down, but of course, if you were doing more work, there would be real benefit in that. And one of the other ideas that came out of talking to Aaron Zhu at the University of Indiana, we actually went in and funded part of his PhD work this year, was that if this is something that will run for a long time, we return something called a future. So this expression actually returns immediately. It returns a 3-element array immediately of futures. And you can do structural operations like reshape on that without blocking. But if you were to do an operation that actually required the value of those arrays, APL would automatically block at that point. So you can do concurrent programming without semaphores and so on. You can have a very elegant model of concurrent programming, which I think will be easy enough to use for the domain expert. The model domain expert will be able to use this for concurrent programming. That's the goal anyway. Okay, number 4, functional power. I found this really nice cartoon, I thought. There's an interesting and a very nice fact we've discovered is that functional programming is now on the lips of everybody who's working on parallel programming. So even Java, the next release of Java, supports functional programming, lambda expressions in Java. And the reason for that is, of course, if you're programming without side effects, then the work can easily be distributed without the system having to worry about collecting the side effects and how they might interfere with each other. And some of the features of other array languages I think all of these things here are in J, but they were actually also mostly proposed and some of them implemented in Sharp APL when Iverson was at Sharp in the late 80s, I think. Some of them, anyway. These have the advantage of both being very powerful and allowing you to express things much more succinctly, but they also lead programmers in a more functional direction, which means that if you write code using these expressions, the interpreter will have more opportunities to parallelize the expressions that you write. So that's something that we're also going to be spending significant time on, and we really recommend that if you're thinking about any sort of major new development, take a look at defuns. Defuns have really, in my mind at least, gone from being something that I guess John was allowed to do to amuse himself at one point a long time ago, into becoming something which is now really very, very mainstream and very important to us. Right, so here's one that we really haven't done enough on in these 8 years, at least, where I've been CTO. I've been focusing mostly on the professional users because those are the people who I meet on a daily basis. But this is something which is now really becoming important. We want... Yeah, these signs, they have these road signs in the United States. This is not a Photoshop. This is a real photograph from the United States of America. I cycled past one of these signs and it made me feel really uncomfortable. Especially because many of these signs, as you would expect, have bullet holes in them. And, admittedly, for a very long time, we have been focused on the needs of professional users. I think Dyalog APL has been the APL for the people who really wanted to write shrink-wrapped software and distribute it or write high-performance multi-user servers. But now is the time, as you've seen with TryAPL, is one of our first real attempts to make APL really attractive to a new generation of users. And we admit we don't know exactly what's needed here, so one of the things we want to do, and we've already talked to one university in the UK about them coming and doing this, is we need an external usability study. We need to know how the graduate students or high school students view APL. We can't figure that out without external help. But there's some things we think we know we need to do. We need this integrated graphics in the session that was mentioned yesterday as an idea for TryAPL. You really want to be able to devote part of your session. I think J has some modes where that works, and MATLAB will do that. So you can be working with data and you can have a graphical representation. And as you change your data, you can see the graphs changing. And we need to make sure that the young people who take a look at APL and think, well, it looks interesting, but I have all this work, I have all this expertise in R or MATLAB, I have all these libraries that I use. I'm not willing to give APL, I'm not willing to give these things up in order to use APL. You want to be able to combine the use of APL with these things very easily. And finally, this is something where we actually have started doing really serious work. Though the MyServer and Source, we've been talking about them for a while, they've really been experimental frameworks, but now we really want to push hard on them and turn them into really industrial strength frameworks where with just APL out of the box and not necessarily or with no IIS or Apache or any other frameworks, you can host web servers and web services. Of course, you should also be able to host them behind IIS or Apache if you want to do that, if your corporation prefers you to put them behind security mechanisms and firewalls. Of course, you need to be able to do that. Yeah, and the last item there, which I guess is a fairly mysterious wording. The idea is if people start building a lot of lightweight services in APL, we need something similar to the Java Enterprise Bean management system to allow you to launch lots of APL processes on the server, connect to them with RIDE when they go down, and sort of manage this whole pool of applications running up there. So I think it's fair to say that in version 11 and 12 we did a lot of sort of really fundamental things to modernize APL, to integrate, to make APL something which could easily integrate into development tools that other people were using, and that new users coming to APL wouldn't find APL so mysterious. Versions 13.0, 1, 2 have been a consolidation phase, working on stability. We put a lot of stuff in fast. There were some bugs. We're removing them. Improving the performance wherever we slowed it down. But the next 3 years, with maybe a couple of major releases, there should be really fundamental movement. You should expect APL running on all the interesting platforms that are out there. That we really make these tools that we're working on available also on all of those platforms. Try APL, I can't remember if Brian mentioned that yesterday. He develops it on Windows. He saves the workspace over onto the Linux box, and it runs. There isn't a single line of code that changes. And we want to make it, if possible, so that, because a lot of our users are not very technical, that you can work in that manner. You write an application in APL and you just move it anywhere that you want. We really want to crack this problem of putting parallel computing at the fingertips of the domain expert. If we can do that, it will be amazing. The interest in APL will explode. And we really want to work hard now on attracting the new users and making APL attractive in education. Guido mentioned the work on the Raspberry Pi, etc. And something which isn't a very sexy topic, but something which is becoming more and more important, and there's a workshop on Thursday that you can still go to on security. We need to make sure that as people get more and more web-oriented, that there is security behind everything, all the applications that you build. You can easily do encryption, and again, in a portable fashion. You can write encryption code on Windows. It'll run on Android, etc. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. Fortunately, we have a large number of talks where people will be going into detail on various aspects of this. So immediately after me, after the coffee break, Andrej Filinski from the University of Copenhagen is going to be talking about some of the work that he's doing and where Dyalog has been invited to participate in, at least advising on what would be useful to us. Roger on Tuesday is going to be talking about some benchmarks that we're now actually going to make available, publish the results of with every release, so that we can guarantee that performance doesn't degrade without us knowing about it. And some, of course, some of the performance enhancements that he's been working on. I suspect he'll spend most of the time talking about the enhancements, because the benchmarks are not very exciting. And that's not a typo. There are 2 A's in that title from Bob. Bob has been probably the person who spent the most amount of time so far looking at the problems of compiling APL, and is also going to be involved in these various projects that we're working on, if we can make that work. And he's going to be talking about some of the latest results that he has. On the functional power side, today John and Roger are going to be talking about some of these the details of these language features that we're proposing for version 14. And John's going to entertain us this evening with, there was an abstract. I asked for an abstract that would make it clearer what the talk was about, but it didn't help. But it'll be good fun, I'm sure. I'm coming. Andy's going to be talking about the work we've been doing on Unix in making it easier to move, sort of get the same kind of functionality on Unixes as we have on Windows. Liam's going to be talking about the work that he's been responsible for on the Visual Studio integration. And there's the mystery talk on Thursday that I'm supposed not to talk much about. Just get you excited to come to that. David, also later today, is going to be demonstrating his editor. I put that in this category of the needs of new users because I needed something to put in that category. But also, I had a chat with David, and he confirmed that, in fact, one of the goals of this is to make it easy for newcomers to APL to get an understanding of the arrays and inspect them and change them. So I wasn't completely wrong. And then a lot of work on frameworks. Whether these talks all really belong in that section, I don't know, but JD is going to be telling us, I think, mostly about the user interface enhancements in 13.2. Brian's going to be talking about these standalone web application frameworks. I think that's really, I think a lot of people still don't realize quite what's possible there. You can now build fairly decent looking applications that'll run on tablets and smartphones. Dan will be talking about work on user commands, and Kai is going to be talking about a search and replace tool that he uses, which has a lot of features that we don't yet make available in the product itself. And I'm going to be talking about the file server. And here's a picture. You've already seen this. Is that not purple? Okay, it's red over there. Somebody said it's purple to a man. How was Karen? Okay. And I was. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. No, I can do it. I would try. I wanted to tell you a bit more about Liam's talk on Thursday, but he really didn't want me to show you much. He gave me this sort of low resolution thing that I could play for you here, briefly. Unfortunately, what we're doing here is we're using something called. It's cutting off the edge here. Maybe it doesn't matter so much. I think the whole point of this was that it wouldn't be very good, so you'd just be slightly excited and come to Liam's talk. So this is a VNC session on Windows, which is connected to that Android machine over there. So we're seeing the same thing here. The reason we're showing you both is that there's a lot of delay here, and you only get an update every couple of seconds. So here we are. We've loaded a workspace on an Android device, and we don't have the APL font working yet. Oh dear. Yes. Let me see if I can get back to roughly the same place. Okay, so we've written a function here. I'm not going to describe it because I'm managing to run out of time despite having extra time. We're actually just generating an HTML file here. We're generating 4 HTML files containing a multiplication table, an addition table, an equals table, and a power table. And then we've pre-cooked another dynamic HTML page, which inserts those into a 3-dimensional rotating grid to excite the kids. So he's running the function and now starting up a web browser on the device. And you need to look carefully up in the right-hand corner because you'll see the rotations happening there. And then when it settles down, you'll see the details of what's in there. So he's going to switch between the tables now. And you see them rotating. Wow. This is the kind of games you need to play, though, I think. And then when he goes back, it goes flippity-flip. Cool. So if you want to see that in high resolution, it's Thursday morning. And a lot more details about the project. So, read the documents if you have time. Please fill in that voting form by Wednesday so that we can use the results, if there are any, in our closing session on Thursday. 4 minutes to spare. Okay, so there's 33 minutes for coffee, and then Andrei Filinski will be telling us about compiling? Or what exactly? Well, he'll introduce himself when it's time. Associative scans and other interesting stuff. Yep, see you in half an hour.